The Confederation Scout probe descended through Earth's atmosphere with the cold precision of a surgical instrument. Its quantum-enhanced sensors swept across the planetary surface, collecting data points that would ultimately prove to be its undoing. Chief Analyst Sandvar had meticulously programmed every algorithm, every predictive model to analyze this supposedly primitive world. What could possibly go wrong? Deep in the suburbs of San Jose, California, a group of teenagers huddled around a collection of modified consumer drones, their fingers dancing across custom-built interfaces. Zara Reyes, a 17-year-old coding prodigy with electric blue hair and more computer monitors than wall space, leaned forward with a mischievous grin. "You see that?" she muttered to her friends. "Something's not right about that signal." The probe, a sleek graphite-colored vessel no larger than a compact car, continued its descent. Its primary directive was simple: gather comprehensive data about Earth's technological and social infrastructure without direct engagement. Stealth was its primary weapon, anonymity its shield. The Confederation had sent thousands of such probes to countless worlds. Most returned with predictable, mundane information about developing civilizations. This probe would be different. Marcus Chen, Zara's best friend and an amateur radio enthusiast, was the first to notice the anomaly. "The electromagnetic signature is weird," he said, pulling up multiple spectral analyses on his holographic display. It's broadcasting, but trying to hide that it's broadcasting." What the teenagers didn't know was that the probe represented the advance guard of the Galactic Confederation, a vast, bureaucratic network of species that had spent millennia categorizing and often subjugating developing civilizations. To them, Earth was just another potential acquisition, another world to be studied, classified, and eventually integrated into their massive galactic infrastructure. Zara's fingers flew across her custom keyboard. "I'm going to ping it," she announced, a statement that was equal parts declaration and challenge. The probe's sophisticated AI registered the incoming signal milliseconds before it hit. For a brief moment, its quantum processors calculated potential responses, threat assessments, diplomatic protocols. It never stood a chance. What happened next was less a hacking and more a complete deconstruction. The teenagers, working with a spontaneity that would baffle any traditional military strategist, didn't just breach the probe's defenses. They dismantled them, reproposed them, and turned the entire technological marvel into something entirely unexpected. Lines of code became musical notes. Quantum encryption protocols transformed into interactive art. The probe's advanced sensing equipment was systematically reprogrammed, its components redistributed across a network that shifted and changed faster than any traditional tracking system could follow. "Livestream in 3, 2, 1, Marcus whispered. The entire encounter was broadcast globally, cutting through military networks, social media platforms, and underground communication channels. Within minutes, what should have been a classified encounter became a global phenomenon. Chief Analyst Sandvar, light years away in the Confederation's Central Command, would later watch the recording with a growing sense of horror. The probe, a marvel of galactic engineering that had cost more resources than entire planetary economies, had been completely neutralized by a group of human teenagers who treated advanced technology like an interactive art project. But the most shocking part, they were laughing. Not with malice, not with aggression, but with a pure, unbridled sense of creative joy that the Confederation had never encountered in any species they'd previously cataloged. As the last components of the probe were repurposed into an impromptu digital sculpture that was simultaneously a piece of performance art and a complex mathematical algorithm, one thing became abundantly clear. Humanity was not going to be an easy civilization to understand. Ambassador Krulvax of the Galactic Confederation adjusted the quantum stabilization implant at the base of his cranial ridge. The device was supposed to provide perfect emotional control, maintaining the diplomatic neutrality that had served his species for millennia. Right now, it was malfunctioning spectacularly. The press conference hall in Geneva was nothing like the sterile diplomatic chambers of Galactic Protocol. Sunlight streamed through massive windows, illuminating a room that was part high-tech conference center, part living artwork. Plants hung from ceiling installations, interactive holographic displays shifted with seemingly random patterns, and the seating arrangement defied every standard of hierarchical positioning that Krelvax understood. Dr. Maya Chen stood at the podium, a woman who seemed to defy categorization. Her credentials were a study in impossible combinations, a quantum physicist with a doctorate in comparative mythology, a published poet who had also designed breakthrough neural network algorithms. Her smile was both a welcome and a challenge. "Welcome," she began, "to Earth." Those 3 words should have been simple. They were anything but. Krelvax's translator implant struggled to capture the layers of meaning. The word in Maya's native Mandarin carried nuances of invitation, of challenge, of complex cultural welcome that no straightforward translation could capture. His diplomatic protocols began to generate error messages. The first question came from an unexpected source. A street musician who had somehow acquired press credentials stood up, a traditional Urhu instrument slung over his shoulder. "How do your people understand first contact?" he asked, his question seemingly simple but laden with philosophical complexity. Before Krelvax could respond, Maya intercepted. "Excellent question," she said, and then did something completely unprecedented. She began to sing. It wasn't a song in any traditional sense. It was a complex mathematical sequence transformed into sound, a representation of prime number interactions that was simultaneously a scientific explanation, a musical performance, and a form of communication that existed between language, mathematics, and pure emotion. The musician, without missing a beat, began to accompany her on his Urhu. The sound transformed the entire press conference into something that was neither diplomatic meeting nor concert, but a living, breathing form of cross-cultural communication. Krelvax's emotional stabilization implant finally gave up, overloaded by the sheer complexity of human interaction. In the back of the room, a team of linguists, quantum physicists, and performance artists watched with a mixture of excitement and professional fascination. They had spent months preparing for this moment, developing communication protocols that went far beyond traditional diplomatic exchanges. "We're not just meeting," Maya said when the impromptu performance concluded. "We're beginning a conversation." The word conversation in her usage was nothing like the formal communication protocols of the Galactic Confederation. It implied something living, something that could change and adapt, something that was more process than endpoint. Diplomatic reports would later struggle to categorize what had just occurred. Was it a press conference? A musical performance? A scientific demonstration? A philosophical exchange? The answer, frustratingly for the Confederation's analysts, was all of these things and none of them. As Krelvax would later report to his superiors, humanity had just demonstrated that first contact was not about information exchange. It was about connection, a concept so fluid, so dynamic, that it defied every standard protocol in galactic history. The press conference had lasted exactly 47 minutes. By galactic standards, it should have been a simple, structured event. Instead, it had become something that would be discussed, analyzed, and remembered for generations. And it was only the beginning. The Galactic Confederation's quantum blockade materialized around Earth with mathematical precision. Trillion-dollar technology designed to isolate entire planetary systems, to cut off all forms of communication and technological transmission, descended like an invisible cage. Admiral Zeltorn watched the deployment from the command deck of the hegemony's most advanced flagship, a smug confidence radiating from his crystalline exoskeleton. Containment protocol initiated, the ship's AI announced in its clinical tone. Quantum interference field at 99.997% effectiveness. No technological transmission possible. What the Confederation didn't understand was the nature of human innovation. In a converted warehouse in Oakland, California, a team that would have been dismissed as a random collection of misfits was about to change everything. Aria Rodriguez, a 42-year-old former circus performer turned quantum computing specialist, stood before a wall of screens. To her left, Lin Wei, a 19-year-old coding prodigy who had been kicked out of 3 universities for unauthorized creativity, manipulated holographic interfaces with fingers that seemed to dance between dimensions. "They think technology is about hardware," Arya muttered, her hands moving in complex gestures that controlled multiple systems simultaneously. "We know it's about imagination." The quantum blockade worked on a simple principle: create a field of quantum interference so dense that no coherent information could pass through. It had worked on 247 previous planetary systems. It would not work on Earth. Lin's fingers flew across interfaces that seemed to blur the line between programming and performance art. "We're not breaking their system," he explained to the team. "We're going to make it sing." What happened next was less a hack and more a complete reimagining of technological interaction. The team didn't try to punch through the blockade. Instead, they began to play with it. Using a combination of blockchain technology, quantum entanglement, and what could only be described as weaponized creativity, they started to transform the blockade itself. Lines of code became musical notes. Quantum encryption protocols transformed into interactive art installations. The very technology designed to contain humanity became a medium of expression. On the Confederation flagship, alarms began to sound. The quantum blockade wasn't just being bypassed, it was being rewritten, repurposed, transformed into something that defied every known technological principle. "Impossible," Admiral Zeltorn whispered, watching in horror as the blockade began to shimmer and change. Arya laughed, a sound of pure, unbridled joy. "Technology is just another form of language," she said, "and we're going to have a conversation." The team wasn't just breaking through the blockade. They were turning it into a global art project, a distributed network that shifted and changed faster than any tracking system could follow. Communication packets became visual poetry. Encryption protocols transformed into collaborative musical compositions. Within hours, what should have been a definitive act of technological suppression became a planetary celebration of human creativity. News feeds around the world showed the quantum blockade transforming. In Tokyo, a group of street artists projected interactive designs onto the invisible field. In Rio de Janeiro, musicians created instruments that played the very frequencies of the containment technology. In Cairo, mathematicians and poets collaborated on algorithms that turned the blockade into a living, breathing piece of global communication. Admiral Zeltorn could only watch in mounting terror as humanity did something no species in galactic history had ever done. They didn't just survive the blockade. They made it beautiful. As the last lines of code settled, Lin looked up with a grin. "I think," he said, "we just had a conversation." The Confederation's Psychological Warfare Division had never failed, not once in 3,000 years of galactic dominance. Their communication frequencies were designed to penetrate the most resilient neural networks, to induce fear, submission, and total psychological capitulation. Species after species had crumbled beneath their precision-engineered psychic assault. Earth would be different. Dr. Elena Oko stood in the Global Empathy Response Center, a facility that looked more like an avant-garde art installation than a military command post. Banks of equipment surrounded her: quantum resonance chambers, neurological interface networks, and devices that blurred the line between technology and pure emotional intelligence. "Incoming psychic transmission," announced Marcus Chen, the lead quantum linguist. His fingers hovered over interfaces that seemed to breathe and pulse with living energy. Frequency approaching maximum destabilization potential. The alien attack was elegant in its mathematical precision. Psychic waves designed to trigger every known fear response in biological organisms began to wash over the planet. These were frequencies that had broken entire civilizations, that could reduce advanced species to trembling, submissive populations in matter of moments. But humanity had something the Confederation could never comprehend. "We're not going to block it," Elena said quietly. "We're going to transform it." What happened next would be studied by xenopsychologists for generations. Instead of resistance, the human response team began to do something utterly unprecedented. They started to listen, not just with ears or minds, but with an entire network of emotional intelligence that defied traditional understanding. Artists began to translate the destructive frequencies into visual representations. Therapists mapped the psychological attack vectors. Quantum physicists broke down the communication into its fundamental components. Musicians began to compose responses that were part scientific analysis, part emotional resonance, part pure artistic expression. The fear frequencies hit Earth like a tidal wave and were immediately absorbed, transformed, reimagined. Where the Confederation expected terror, they found something else entirely. The psychic assault was being processed, understood, and then reflected back as something completely unexpected. It wasn't a counterattack. It was an invitation to understanding. On the Confederation flagship, Chief Psychological Warfare Strategist Krenvax watched in mounting horror. The human response defied every known protocol of psychological engagement. They weren't fighting the frequency. They were having a conversation with it. Massive screens showed the global human response. In Barcelona, a group of performance artists was translating the fear frequencies into a living dance installation. In Mumbai, a team of neuroscientists and poets were creating a linguistic map of the psychological assault. In Sao Paulo, musicians were turning the destructive frequencies into a global symphony. The attack wasn't being resisted. It was being transformed into an act of collective creativity. "This is impossible," Krenvax muttered, his translation implants overloading with the complexity of human response. Elena Oko smiled. "Empathy," she said to her team, "is the most advanced form of communication." The psychological assault that should have broken humanity instead became a planetary moment of collective understanding. Fear was being processed, transformed, understood. The very frequencies designed to destroy were being repurposed into a global art piece that spoke of resilience, creativity, and an almost incomprehensible capacity for emotional intelligence. By the time the transmission ended, the Confederation had learned something fundamental about humanity. They didn't just survive psychological warfare. They made art out of it. The Confederation's War Council assembled in their most secure transmission chamber, a spherical room constructed from quantum-locked metamaterials that could withstand the direct impact of a neutron star. Representatives from 17 different species gathered, their collective technological might representing centuries of advanced development. They were about to be humbled by a team that included a retired circus performer, a teenage coding prodigy, and a quantum physicist with an inexplicable passion for interpretive dance. Dr. Samira Rais adjusted her holographic interface, her movements a strange blend of mathematical precision and artistic fluidity. To her left, Kaijong, all of 19 years old, with more computing power in his custom neural implant than entire planetary networks, watched the Confederation's war preparations with a look of bemused curiosity. "They think technology is about hardware," Samira muttered, her fingers tracing complex quantum algorithms that seemed to dance between mathematical equations and abstract art. "We know it's about imagination." The Confederation's technological assault was a marvel of galactic engineering. Quantum-entangled weapon systems capable of simultaneously existing in multiple dimensional states, adaptive AI networks that could predict and counter enemy strategies milliseconds before they were conceived, gravitational manipulation technologies that could literally fold space-time into tactical advantages. They were utterly unprepared for human creativity. Kai's neural interface began to pulse with an algorithm that was part computer code, part musical composition, part philosophical treatise. "Watch this," he said, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. What happened next would be studied by technological historians for generations. The team didn't just develop a counter-technology. They transformed the entire concept of technological warfare into something that defied comprehension. Their systems didn't just adapt to the Confederation's weapons. They began to play with them. Quantum weapon systems became interactive art installations. Gravitational manipulation technologies transformed into collaborative musical instruments. AI networks designed for strategic warfare began to generate poetry, philosophical dialogues, and complex aesthetic experiences. On the Confederation flagship, tactical displays began to malfunction in ways that suggested something far more complex than a simple technological breach. It wasn't that the human systems were defeating the alien technologies. They were engaging them in a form of technological dialogue that existed somewhere between communication, art, and pure mathematical poetry. "This is impossible," Admiral Zeltorn growled, watching as weapon systems designed to destroy entire planetary networks were transformed into something that seemed to breathe with its own form of intelligence. Samira laughed, a sound of pure, unbridled joy. "Technology," she said, "is just another language, and we're going to have a conversation." The human team wasn't just developing a technological response. They were reimagining the very concept of technological interaction. Weapon systems that could destroy entire star systems were being repurposed into tools of communication, of understanding, of collective creativity. In Tokyo, a group of artists began to project the quantum weapon interfaces onto city buildings, turning military technology into a global art exhibition. In Rio de Janeiro, musicians created instruments that played the frequencies of gravitational manipulation technologies. In Cairo, mathematicians and poets collaborated on algorithms that transformed weapon systems into living, breathing pieces of interactive art. Kai looked up, his neural interface pulsing with complex algorithms. "I think," he said with a grin, "we just redefined what technology can be." The Confederation had come expecting to find a primitive species they could easily overcome. Instead, they found a civilization that saw technology not as a tool of destruction, but as the most advanced form of communication imaginable. The Global Dialogue Chamber looked nothing like a traditional diplomatic venue. Suspended between three continental landmasses, the structure was part research facility, part art installation, part living ecosystem. Holographic interfaces merged seamlessly with living plant walls. Quantum communication nodes grew like strange, luminescent flowers, their tendrils connecting representatives from every corner of human society. Dr. Maya Chen stood at the center, a conductor of a symphony that defied every known diplomatic protocol. The Confederation's communication specialists had prepared for every possible scenario of cultural exchange. Linguistic algorithms, psychological profiling, centuries of diplomatic experience. None of it could have prepared them for what humanity was about to do. "We're not here to negotiate," Maya announced, her voice carrying a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the quantum communication networks. "We're here to connect." Around her, the most unlikely delegation in galactic history assembled. A street comedian from Mumbai sat next to a quantum physicist from Sao Paulo. A Lakota elder conversed with a young neuroscientist from Seoul. An Australian Aboriginal artist compared notes with a blockchain developer from Lagos. The Confederation observers watched in mounting confusion. This was not a diplomatic meeting. This was a living, breathing demonstration of human complexity. The first speaker was unexpected. Raj Patel, a stand-up comedian turned cross-cultural mediator, stepped forward. His presentation was simultaneously a comedy routine, a philosophical treatise, and a deconstruction of interstellar communication protocols. "Imagine," he began, "that communication is less about words and more about the space between them." What followed was nothing short of a cultural reconfiguration of everything the Confederation understood about interaction. The team didn't just present information. They transformed diplomatic exchange into a multi-layered performance that was part scientific presentation, part artistic expression, part collective meditation. A traditional Japanese tea ceremony played out simultaneously with a quantum physics demonstration. Indigenous storytelling techniques were used to explain complex mathematical models. Musical compositions became mathematical proofs. Every moment challenged the very concept of how information could be shared. On the Confederation observation deck, Chief Diplomatic Analyst Krenvax could only watch in mounting bewilderment. This was not a negotiation. This was a complete reimagining of communication itself. The human team demonstrated something fundamental. Communication was not about transmission of information, but about creating shared understanding. Each presentation layer was simultaneously literal and metaphorical, scientific and emotional, individual and collective. A merry war dance became a complex explanation of quantum entanglement. A Peruvian weaving technique illustrated the mathematical principles of distributed networks. An African drumming rhythm mapped out the communication protocols of neural networks. "We're not trying to convince you of anything," Mayat explained. "We're inviting you to understand." The Confederation had encountered thousands of civilizations. They had protocols for peaceful contact, for conflict, for subjugation. They had never encountered a species that saw communication as a form of collective creativity. By the time the session concluded, the Confederation observers had been transformed. They hadn't been presented with information. They had been invited into a living, breathing demonstration of human potential. Raj Patel's final statement captured the essence of the encounter. "Communication," he said with a smile, "is just another word for falling in love with possibility." The diplomatic world would never be the same. The weapon descended with mathematical precision, a culmination of millennia of galactic warfare technology. The Confederation's ultimate deterrent, a quantum dissolution device capable of completely neutralizing a planet's entire technological and biological infrastructure. It was a weapon that had ended civilizations, erased entire evolutionary paths, reduced complex societies to atomic dust. They were about to learn that humanity was not like any civilization they had ever encountered. Dr. Elena Oko stood in the Global Response Center, a facility that looked more like a living, breathing organism than a traditional command post. Holographic interfaces pulsed with living light, quantum networks grew like neural pathways, and the entire system seemed to breathe with a collective intelligence that defied traditional technological understanding. "Incoming dissolution wave," announced Marcus Chen, his fingers dancing across interfaces that seemed to blur the line between technology and art. "Quantum's signature at maximum destructive potential." The Confederation believed they were delivering a final decisive blow. They were about to deliver an invitation to something entirely unexpected. What happened next would be recorded in galactic history as the moment humanity redefined the very concept of resistance. Instead of attempting to block or counteract the weapon, the human response team began to do something utterly unprecedented. They started to listen. Not with traditional defensive systems, but with an entire network of collective intelligence that transformed the incoming destruction into an opportunity for creation. Artists began to translate the weapon's destructive frequencies into visual representations. Quantum physicists broke down its molecular structure into complex mathematical poetry. Musicians began to compose responses that were part scientific analysis, part emotional resonance, part pure artistic expression. The dissolution wave hit Earth like a tsunami of pure, calculated annihilation, and was immediately absorbed, understood, transformed. On the Confederation flagship, Admiral Zeltorn watched in mounting horror. The weapon that had ended countless civilizations was being processed, understood, and then reflected back as something completely unexpected. It wasn't a counterattack. It was an invitation to understanding. Massive screens showed the global human response. In Barcelona, a group of performance artists was translating the dissolution frequencies into a living dance installation. In Mumbai, a team of neuroscientists and poets were creating a linguistic map of the weapon's molecular structure. In Sao Paulo, musicians were turning the destructive frequencies into a global symphony. The weapon wasn't being resisted. It was being transformed into an act of collective creativity. "This is impossible," Admiral Zeltorn muttered, his most advanced tracking systems overloading with the complexity of human response. Elena Oko smiled. "Destruction," she said to her team, "is just another form of creation we haven't understood yet." The dissolution weapon that should have ended humanity instead became a planetary moment of collective transformation. Destructive energy was being processed, understood, reimagined. The very frequencies designed to erase were being repurposed into a global art piece that spoke of resilience, creativity, and an almost incomprehensible capacity for turning challenge into opportunity. By the time the transmission ended, the Confederation had learned something fundamental about humanity. They didn't just survive the ultimate weapon of destruction. They made beauty out of it. As the last resonances of the dissolution wave faded, Marcus looked up with a grin that was equal parts scientific precision and pure human joy. "I think," he said, "we just rewrote the rules of existence." The weapon designed to end civilization had instead become humanity's most profound statement of potential. The Galactic Confederation's Central Council chamber fell silent. Holographic representations of 17 different species hung suspended in a space that had, for millennia, been the ultimate arbiter of galactic civilization. For the first time in 3,000 years, they were confronting something they could not categorize, control, or comprehend. Humanity was not a civilization to be conquered. Humanity was an invitation to reimagine everything. Dr. Maya Chen stood at the center of a transmission field that spanned multiple star systems, her presence both physical and something entirely more complex. Around her, a delegation that defied every traditional diplomatic model. Artists, scientists, philosophers, musicians, mathematicians, waited with a collective anticipation that seemed to vibrate with potential. "We're not here to fight," Maya began, her voice carrying through quantum communication networks that pulsed like living things. "We're here to connect." The representatives of the Galactic Confederation had prepared for every possible scenario of first contact. Diplomatic protocols, linguistic algorithms, centuries of interstellar negotiation experience. None of it could have prepared them for humanity. Chief Analyst Santhar, who had first studied the initial probe's encounter, now understood the true depth of human potential. What they had initially seen as chaos was actually the most advanced form of communication imaginable. The humans didn't present a defense. They offered a vision. Holographic displays began to shift, showing not military capabilities or technological specifications, but something far more profound. A living representation of human potential that was simultaneously a scientific demonstration, an art installation, and a philosophical treatise. Indigenous storytelling techniques explained complex quantum principles. Musical compositions became mathematical proofs. A traditional Japanese tea ceremony illustrated the principles of distributed network theory. An Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime narrative mapped out the potential of interstellar cooperation. "We're not asking to join your civilization," Maya explained. "We're inviting you to expand your understanding of what civilization can be." The Confederation had encountered thousands of species. They had protocols for peaceful contact, for conflict, for subjugation. They had never encountered a species that saw existence itself as a collaborative art form. Each presentation layer was simultaneously literal and metaphorical, scientific and emotional, individual and collective. The humans weren't just sharing information. They were demonstrating a fundamental truth about existence itself. Raj Patel, the comedian-turned-diplomat, stepped forward. His presentation was a complex dance between humor, philosophy, and pure scientific insight. "Imagine," he said, "that the universe is not a series of competing systems, but a collaborative artwork constantly being created." The Confederation representatives found themselves transformed. They hadn't been presented with a negotiation. They had been invited into a living, breathing demonstration of potential. By the time the transmission concluded, something fundamental had changed. The Galactic Confederation was no longer looking at a potential conquest. They were witnessing the emergence of a new way of understanding existence itself. Chief Analyst Santhar's final report would become legendary. "Humanity is not a civilization to be understood. Humanity is an ongoing invitation to reimagine what is possible." As the transmission fields began to dissolve, Maya Chen looked at her team, a group that represented the extraordinary complexity of human potential. Scientists and artists, philosophers and engineers, each bringing a unique perspective to a moment that would redefine galactic civilization. "We're not done," she said with a smile. "We're just beginning." The universe held its breath.